The Institute for Health and Healing is a comprehensive integrative medicine program at Sutter Health, dedicated to healing people and transforming healthcare. Check us out at myhealthandhealing.org or on Facebook.
Welcome to the Q&A portion of tonight. It's been fantastic. I've got some really interesting and wonderful questions so far, so we're going to try and get to everybody's question. Okay. There's a couple complicated ones maybe in here. We're going to just kind of go through these. Dr. Gottfried, is there a connection between, is there an inflammatory connection between Hashimoto's and ERPR positive breast cancer? I have both.
This is a complicated question. You know, whenever I answer a question, I also try to generalize it. So the question about Hashimoto's, and I'll just back up for a second, and Jennifer, I want you to chime in about this too. Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition when your immune system attacks your thyroid tissue. It's very common. About 95% of the people with low thyroid function have Hashimoto's. It's not always diagnosed only on blood testing. And it's a sign that you have an overactive immune system. Breast cancer, and I don't want you to think that I'm an expert at breast cancer. I do talk about breast cancer quite a bit in younger because so many of us have genes that put us at a greater risk of breast cancer. So right now in the US, the lifetime risk for a woman to have breast cancer is 12.5%. I have a gene called CHEK2 that gives me a 3 to 5x increased risk of breast cancer. And I discovered it when I was writing the book. I made a list of kind of all the genes that put you at a greater risk of breast cancer. Came up with about 10 to 12 that I thought were the most important, including BRCA1 and BRCA2 that most of us have heard of. And then I tested my genome and found that I had CHEK2. CHEK2 is also a tumor suppressor gene, so it's involved in the inflammatory response. But in terms of asking this question about a link between Hashimoto's and ER positive breast cancer, I don't know. So the way I would look at it is to do a literature search and to see if there's a correlation between the two. But you may know more about this.
Yeah. So I agree. As far as a link, I don't know either. You know, I think when I think about most diseases, I come from the... Okay. Sorry about that. Is this better? So I agree. I don't know about a link between the two, but I always think about the common denominator for so many diseases, like we mentioned, being stress, toxins, and inflammation. So how all of that specifically is working together and might cause an increased risk for that combination that you have for the person who asked, I don't know. But I would say that those three factors are playing a big role.
That was a tough one right out of the gates. Yeah, I've got an easier question for you.
Oh, good.
Dr. Griffin,
Oh, good.
you mentioned that magnesium was one of your favorite supplements. So we'd all like to know what dose of magnesium do you recommend?
Okay, well, it depends what's going on. If it's bedtime and we're doing it for sleep, I usually recommend anywhere between 200 and 400 milligrams. That might be too much for some people because magnesium can have the side effect of loosening your bowels. So it's great if you have insomnia and constipation. But there are different forms of magnesium. So that's really important too. Magnesium glycinate being a form that's more gentle on the gut, magnesium oxide, more aggressive on the gut. So anywhere between 200 and 400 for bedtime, and if for moving bowels, it often takes at least 400, in my opinion. Dr. Gottfried can weigh in.
So another takeaway for tonight, I think, is to know that we're speaking from a place of best evidence. We're talking about randomized trials. What do we know from randomized trials in terms of guiding us with supplement decisions, behavioral modification, and even more important than a randomized trial is what's true for you. So there are some people who take 200 to 400 milligrams of magnesium, and they do great, and it helps them sleep. They don't have the muscle tension that they usually have. It makes a big difference. And then there's people like me who need about 1,800 milligrams of magnesium. So the question is, what's true for you? And sometimes it takes some experimentation to figure that out. I have some patients who do great on 400 milligrams. I have others who need much more. It depends on how magnesium deficient are you to begin with, right? And you can measure that. So you can measure your red blood cell magnesium level, and you can titrate. So knowing what's true for you, I think, is so important. It's kind of the horizontal through all these verticals that we're addressing tonight. What's the right amount of exercise? What's the type of exercise that's the best for you? What's the best kind of way to manage stress? What's the best food for you to eat? I was talking about how paleo didn't work well for me. I also tried keto. Ketogenic diet, any fans of ketogenic diet in the audience? So I tried a ketogenic diet and I gained 14 pounds. It was very inflammatory for me. So there's about 10 genes that make a ketogenic diet not a good fit, and I have one of them. So it's that, I think it's almost a sacred duty that we have, to do trial and error and trial and success and see what's true for you.
We hear a lot about, it's almost a supplement overload nowadays, and it can be confusing. So this is a good question, I think. It wasn't touched on, but perhaps either one could take this. It's about apple cider vinegar, and could you please talk about it? Tell us why you might use it, and if it should be something you use every day, if that's the case.
You want me to talk about it? Okay. So I like apple cider vinegar. It's been shown in, I believe, a randomized trial that 1 tablespoon in 8 to 12 ounces of water lowers your fasting glucose. So a lot of people find that this is an inexpensive way of dealing with the issue of blood sugar dysregulation. Not everyone likes the taste of it, but it's one of those, it's almost like an urban myth that's been proven to be effective. So we talked about a lot of different levers that can make a difference with your blood sugar regulation. And I talked about fasting blood sugar, but of course that's not the whole story. What matters also is how you respond to food. When I have a banana, my fasting blood sugar goes from about 75 to about 180. That's not good. I don't do well with high fructose fruit. I can get away with, about a half cup of berries. That's all I can do in terms of eating fruit. And so I tend to eat a lot more vegetables. So that's just an example. It's not about me, it's more about what's true for you in terms of your blood sugar. So I'm not having apple cider vinegar right now. I'm kind of out of my apple cider vinegar phase. But a lot of people find it to be effective. Do you like it with your patients?
Yeah, I personally don't care for the taste, but I can stomach it. But I think it's great. It has acetic acid, which can really help calm down inflammation in the body, and so it's great for people with digestive issues. And if you have heartburn and have trouble with stomach issues, it's a fantastic thing to try. But you need to get it with a mother in it. So mothers, apple cider vinegar, Bragg's is the best brand. Plug there. Dr. Griffin, this question's for you. what other health issues do you talk about with your patients when it comes to functional medicine? There's a lot of terms that get thrown around: functional medicine, integrative medicine, holistic medicine. I think it can be confusing. So are there any other things you like to address with patients when it comes to functional medicine?
So that's a really broad question, but so some things we might, so one of the big things we address in functional medicine is gut health. That's kind of where we begin often because we've learned so much about how our microbiome has an impact on the rest of our body and our systems, including our brain. So I often start there for many different things that come in, many different types of symptoms, look at the gut. Of course, I do a lot of work in hormone balance, as you know. Other types of things I might look at are toxin levels, like heavy metals, depending on what's going on for the patient. I'd say the biggest is the exploration of gut health because a lot of people come to me with digestive issues. And also, with all the autoimmunity that's going on in the world, really, and most of the immune system lying in the gut, then we start there.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Do you have a sequence of testing that you do? I know you don't have one pattern, it's based on the patient, but do you have are there labs that you tend to order the first time you see somebody and then kind of the second or third time? Do you have a sequence in your organizational approach? I hear what you're saying about the gut, I'm with you there. But maybe just if you could rattle off some of the testing that you do, I think that can help to organize the thinking around it.
So again, it really depends on what's coming in. I'm not super test heavy. I think I was when I started, and now I'm more particular about what tests I order because it's a lot of information. It can be overwhelming to patients and myself. Functional medicine testing is very complex, looks at a lot of different things. Some of it's very important, and some of it may be less important initially anyway. So most people get a look at the gut when they come in. I often do a comprehensive nutritional panel because there's so much of my work is food as medicine. So I'm looking at nutritional panels that are looking at many vitamin and mineral levels, including things like CoQ10, common vitamins and minerals that you know of, A, D, C, everything. And a panel that looks also at heavy metal toxins like mercury, lead, arsenic in the body, which is also important. Omega-3 fatty acid levels is something else I might look at to look at that balance in the body. And then hormone testing, I look at a lot. I do a lot of urine and saliva hormone testing. I do a lot of urine testing to look at those estrogen metabolites that I talked about, especially in my patients that have already had breast cancer. And I want to look at what are those metabolites looking like now, because we can try to help those pathways and push towards healthier metabolites through nutrition. So I often use NutriVal through Genova. That's the one I use the most. How about you?
I do the same. So I do a NutriVal on pretty much every patient when they first come to me. I also do a blood panel, as I'm sure you do. I find that blood testing is often the universal language of conventional medicine, and so it's a way of building bridges with conventional doctors who maybe aren't as open to integrative and functional medicine. Recently, I've moved more toward dried urine testing to look at cortisol, at 4-point cortisol 4 times during the day, and also metabolized cortisol as opposed to free cortisol. I think that gives you a lot of additional information, and you can also do estrogen metabolism. So the one that I tend to use, we mentioned the NutriVal by Genova, and for dried urine testing, I like Precision Analytics.
Kind of switching gears here, this is an interesting question about fertility. And this is for you, Dr. Gottfried. Does the younger protocol also help increase the fertility lifespan?
Oh, that's such a good question. I hope so. So let me think about that for a moment. This is a very deep question. So the way I would organize my thought around this is the aging of the ovary. How do we slow down the aging of the ovary? We know that autoimmune attack of the ovary is not a good thing. So reducing inflammation definitely makes a difference. We know that to be fertile, you need to have your hormones in balance, especially what I call the hormonal Charlie's Angels. So your cortisol, your estrogen together with progesterone, and your thyroid. And a quick side note about that, I was taught as a board-certified gynecologist that women who are trying to get pregnant, especially women who are having trouble getting pregnant, should have every hormone test out there. They should have their estrogen on day 3, along with their FSH. They should have their day 21 and 22 progesterone. We should look at cortisol. We should look at their thyroid function, and not just a TSH. We should look at free T3, free T4. And then, when I was in my 40s, and I went to my doctor and said, hey, I think my hormones are a mess. They said, oh, we're not going to test your hormones. They just vary too much. We're not going to test them. And I was taught that too in medical school. So here's this double standard that we will test these hormones in someone who's trying to get pregnant, but not in a 42-year-old woman who's having issues with her hormones. So I want to call bullshit on that. I think we should test. And so going back to the aging ovary, I don't know of long-term data looking at an anti-inflammatory diet, stress management, and whether that makes a difference in terms of how fast or slow the eggs of the ovary age. We have these different measures to look at whether your eggs are aging, like day 3 estradiol and FSH, and I'm not aware of any data looking specifically about whether an anti-inflammatory diet or other ways of using lifestyle medicine to reduce inflammation makes a difference. Are you? Anything else you want to say? Okay.
Tough questions, but I think important questions. Dr. Griffin, without someone who maybe hasn't done any testing, how would they know if they have inflammation or if they're chronically inflamed? What signs would they look for?
Well, I think Dr. Gottfried spoke to some of that, and I would agree, kind of that you don't feel well in that you're stiff, you're slow, your thinking is slower than it used to be, especially your thinking. That's such a big one. So both, we can kind of say, oh, I'm getting older, I can't quite do that, but really looking deeper at why, because I don't think we should be 40 and feel stiff, really. So, or 50 for that matter, or older. Dr. Gottfried can speak to what she thinks her ceiling is for that. But I lost track of your question. I got excited about we shouldn't feel stiff at 40. Yeah, exactly. No, my husband liked that comment. No. Say the question again, Scott.
Am I one of the Kardashians?
Oh, how do you know you're inflamed? So I guess that says it. I just think that it's musculoskeletal fitness. A lot of complaints. I'm achy, I'm tired, I'm not thinking like I used to, and I think that's a sign of chronic inflammation, like Sarah said.
Important question here, skin. What would help with severe eczema, psoriasis? What can we do?
So when my patients come in with skin issues, I always want to look at their gut, especially if it's autoimmune. And things that are allergic, like eczema, or atopic, as we say. Again, immune system, the whole allergy response being part of our immune system, and going to the gut, looking at food and looking at gut health. And of course, stress, that's huge.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm someone who has eczema, and the way I know that my gut is not working properly, that I have an imbalance in the microbes of my gut, is that I start to develop eczema. Psoriasis I think of differently. It's not an immune condition. I think of eczema as being inflammatory and also in the autoimmune spectrum, but I also think first of the gut. And you know, one of the things I realized, because most of us who practice functional and integrative medicine have done obsessive self-testing, I realized that I didn't have dysbiosis in terms of bacteria, but I had fungal overgrowth, and that was definitely associated with my eczema. And so I'm someone who has a vulnerability toward taking the normal amount of yeast that you have in your gut and overgrowing it. So if I eat too much sugar, if I have too much wine, when I get stressed, stress can poke holes in your gut, leading to leaky gut. I have these tendencies to develop fungal overgrowth, and so that's something that I see commonly in my patients. You know, I would say among my patients with dysbiosis, about 80% of them have a bacterial imbalance, small percentage have parasites, and the remainder have fungal overgrowth.
Do you want a difficult question or an easy question? So, late in life, 62 years old.
That's early. What?
Excuse me. 62 years old, develops sudden onset type 1 diabetes. What did we do? Can we reawaken the pancreas? There's other additional autoimmune hints like Hashimotos. Any thoughts on that? Tough question.
I think of this more as a family practice question.
Honestly, I don't have an immediate answer for that. What can we do to awaken the pancreas once we have type 1 diabetes? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the goal is to not get there, obviously. With prevention before that, and once we're there, I don't have an answer for how to turn that around. Wish I could speak more to that, but I can't.
You know, I think one thing that happens with type 1 diabetes is that folks who suffer with this diagnosis get shipped off to the endocrinologist. And I wish that we could have seen them 10 or 20 years before, where you could have, you know, turned down the spigot on inflammation and reduce the risk of autoimmunity. I was also just looking at some data on how people with hypothyroidism, so you mentioned Hashimoto's too, people with hypothyroidism, 95% of which is Hashimoto's, it's believed that TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, as it rises, it actually dysregulates the pancreas. So high TSH affects the islet cells in the pancreas and can affect your blood sugar. So I wasn't taught about that connection in medical school, and I think it's a really interesting connection to pay attention to. So the converse is also true, that when you regulate TSH, so usually you're filling in the nutrients that someone needs to manage their thyroid function, things like copper, zinc, selenium, vitamin D, and also regulating cortisol. When you do that together with thyroid medication, that can reverse some of the harm that's done to the islet cells in the pancreas. So I don't know that that would help this person who's got type 1 diabetes. I don't know of any data on that, but wish that we could have seen you 10 or 20 years ago. Now, it's never too late. You can also turn down inflammation even with a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes and Hashimotos. You know, one of the things I work on with my patients, I don't see type 1 diabetics, but I see a lot of people with Hashimotos. And my goal with the treatment protocols that I use is to get their antibodies, that attack that you have against your normal thyroid cells, to the normal range. And I see that regularly in my practice. I imagine you see that too. So at least that I know that you can reverse.
One more question. So I'm going to ask this because there are about 4 inquiries about this, and it's just about, tell us more about labs, genetic testing, anything local, and there was a question about 23andMe, if you could elaborate on that.
Oh, of course, yes. This one I teed up, so I'm happy to talk about this. So when I first did genetic testing, I started with a panel of 10 different genes, and this was in about maybe 2005. And the genes that I tested were really helpful, things like the vitamin D receptor. So I found out that I have a faulty vitamin D receptor. I actually need much higher levels of serum vitamin D for it to work properly in my body. So this is the kind of actionable information that I think genetics can really make a difference with. And I think the next 10 to 20 years of medicine is going to be really discerning, okay, here's your genetics, here's your environment, what can you do to optimize the expression of your DNA? We're not quite there yet. So there's some genetic testing that I think is very helpful. I'll mention a few labs. I don't have any financial ties to these. One of my favorite tests is Pathway, pathway.com. Do you do pathway testing? So what I like about Pathway is that they have a few different genetic panels. One is for nutrition and fitness, and it's a real crowd pleaser because it looks at about 200 different SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and it tells you, okay, here's the type of exercise that's the best fit for you. Here are some of the supplements that you may want to consider. Like I have a problem with vitamin D, as I mentioned. I have a problem with vitamin B6, and I need to take more of those. It also really helps with nutrigenomics. So it can really, it gives you, kind of a prediction of the best macronutrient ratios. You have to be a little careful with this because some of the genes kind of cancel each other out, but the report from Pathway is one of the most intuitive reports that I've seen. So it doesn't give you, the kind of report that you get from 23andMe where you just look at your raw data and you think, why did I do this test? I'm not any further along in my understanding of this. So 23andMe is the most affordable. I believe it costs $199. And they had an FDA injunction in 2015 where they couldn't give medical information. So now I think they have about 36 conditions that they can tell you that you're at risk for. They're pretty limited in terms of how relevant they are. But what I like about 23andMe is that you can search the raw data. And you can look specifically at things like, oh, am I like Dr. Sarah and have the CHEK2 gene? Do I have a 3 to 5x increased risk of breast cancer? So with the information in my book, for instance, there's an appendix in the back that allows you to search 23andMe and see if you have some of the genes that I talk about. Another lab that I like a lot is Smart DNA. They're based in Australia. They also have quite an intuitive report. They do some testing that you can't get with 23andMe, especially when it comes to weight loss. So for instance, I have a gene that makes it twice as hard to lose weight as the average person. It was such a relief to find that out. Oh, that's why. And it's not a gene that you get tested with 23andMe. Are there any labs that you like to use for genetic testing?
So that's a very new part of my practice, and I'm very much still learning about gene testing. So I do, if patients bring me 23andMe reports, there are some things I can interpret like the methylation genes and the estrogen detoxification genes, which are CYP genes, some of those, and the ApoE gene, which has, as Dr. Gottfried had on her slide, has to do with lipid metabolism and Alzheimer's disease. So no, I don't have a specific lab at this point.
I have a list of other labs that are mentioned in the appendix of my book. Another one that I like is Kashi. They have condition-specific panels that they'll do for you, like they have one on bone health and osteoporosis. They have another one on weight loss. They have another one on cardiovascular disease. So that can be helpful to kind of target specific conditions. Do you have a favorite lab?
I knew you were going to ask that. You know, 23andMe is so accessible for my patients to kind of get started down that path. And with all testing, you know, it's with caution, and it's new, and the brains are figuring it out. So I think you were right on the money when you said, you know, 90-10, you know, 90% environment, 10% genes. Is that correct? So I take that to heart and try and put people at ease that even if it comes back that your test says you are really high for a certain disease state, that's not written in some stone somewhere, and that you can actually take the power back by lifestyle. So take it with, you know, cautiousness. But
I'd love to end with a moment of hope. Is that all right? So when I ran my 23andMe, I looked at my ApoE result. Because as I mentioned, I have this grandmother who died of Alzheimer's disease, and I was worried. And I found out that I don't have the Alzheimer's gene. So the ApoE gene is a little bit complicated. It's not quite yes-no. It's what's known as a genoset. So you can inherit the ApoE4, which is the gene for Alzheimer's. You can get one copy from one of your parents, or you may inherit 2 copies. So I don't have either copy. I'm actually a ApoE2/3. But if you have 1 or 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene, it's definitely not, you know, that your destiny is to develop Alzheimer's disease. And we live very close to Dr. Dale Bredesen, who lives in Marin County and has published data looking at a series of 100 patients in which he has reversed symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. He's done it with integrative and functional medicine, so it's a great, you know, kind of rallying cry behind the type of medicine that Dr. Griffin practices and that is done at the Institute of Health and Healing. So I just wanted to finish on that positive note.
thank you. Round of applause, Dr. Gottfried and Dr. Griffin, thank you very much.